Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to talk about the book Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale by Mies. And it says Women in the International Division of Labour. We're going to have me, Joe Brew, and Lierre talking about it. We were going to have Susan Hawthorne, but unfortunately she's not well, so she can't do that. So I'm stepping in to do that today. So we're going to discuss it, but I've read it a couple of times, so that will be good. So I'd just like to hand over first to Lierre to introduce why you like the book and a bit about the book. And Lierre, if you want me to fast forward the PowerPoint, do, but otherwise, and then I'll step in and I'm just going to sort out a bit about the vision. Okay, over to you, Lierre.
I will let you do whatever you want with the slides because you made them, so you know what's on them. I have the first copy of this book, and I read it when it first came out, and I had not read it since. So it was an interesting thing for me to go back now and reread it decades later, because I remember when I read it, it was one of those books where you're not even sure what you've learned. You just know that everything has changed. You know, it was like that sense of, wow, this is really a lot. And, you know, it like your whole mind just kind of shifts around while you're reading it. And then, you know, you got something out of it, but what exactly? So it was really fun to reread it and be like, this was a really good book. This was a real contribution to feminism. And I don't think that, at least in the United States, she never got the readership that she should have, at least among the people who really should be reading this. So I'm really glad that we're doing it. And her main point, I think, is that she comes from a Marxist background, or at least that's what she took on. And in a typical radical feminist fashion, you know, you read things that are written by men that are at least male oriented with men at the center, and you see a useful tool, but you realize it hasn't particularly been applied to women correctly or at all. So she takes a materialist analysis and she puts women at the center of it. So she takes these sort of Marxist tools about, you know, appropriation and about exploitation and all of this, and she puts women back into the picture, because Marx and Engels pretty quickly wrote women out. And so her point is that women are treated as if they are just nature by most Marxists, and that men exploit, you know, the way that, you know, in a Marxian sense, the way that men become human is because of work. That, you know, we have hands and we have brains and we use tools and we make things, and that is what makes us human. That gives us, you know, some sort of purpose and dignity and meaning, and that's sort of how we're different from other animals, is that we do this other thing. And the problem with most of these analyses is that it takes the work that women do, and it sees that as just part of nature. It is what men are transforming to become human, and women are just sort of subsumed underneath this as another resource that men get to use in their self-actualization. And she says, no, women are human. And one of the really interesting things that she does in this is she says, this I remember from my original reading, that women's capacity to gestate and give birth is actually a creative act. It's not just nature, that mostly this is written off as just, you know, the earth regenerates and makes life happen, and that's what women do, and that's why women are part of nature. And she's like, no, women are consciously giving birth, deciding to have children, deciding to do this incredibly creative act, just like any other thing that humans do. It's not just, you know, an act of thoughtless animals. And so she says, you know, throughout history, women have decided to have abortions. They've used all kinds of birth control, effective or not, they were at least trying. There's always infanticide, which is never fun. But the point is, women are making conscious decisions that they are going to do this incredibly creative, you know, fecund act of giving birth. And that's not just, quote, nature. That's a thing that human beings, the women part of human beings, are actually doing. So we're not just
brilliant. I'm gonna move on to the first slide, or the second slide. So this is just to, hopefully. So go back a bit more to the introduction. So So we've had a really good sort of idea of the central heart of the book by Lierre, and now I'm going to just run through some of the other books that she's written. So she wrote an autobiography, and it was published in 2010 by Spinifex, so you can get that should be really interesting. She also wrote Ecofeminism with Vandana Shiva, who is, you know, she is the most famous ecofeminist, and she is still prolific in her speaking and writing. So you can just, if you Google or look on YouTube for Vandana Shiva, you'll see her up-to-date stuff. And I was watching a thing by Vandana Shiva very recently from about a couple of months ago, and she's on fire at the moment. She's really, really excellent. You should definitely, if you don't know Vandana Shiva, and definitely the book that Maria Mies wrote with Vandana Shiva is very interesting. And, you know, they call themselves ecofeminists. Well, I'm not sure if Maria Mies does, but certainly Vandana Shiva accepts that label. So they are slightly different from radical feminists, but there's a huge amount of overlap. Then she also wrote The Subsistence Perspective Beyond the Globalized Economy with Veronica Ben-Holt-Thompson. And we'll go into some of this idea about the subsistence perspective today when we're looking at the book that's Patriarchy and Accumulation, which is 1986, because already in 1986, Maria Mies is talking very much about the way that subsistence is part of the solution. It's a resistance strategy that we can use, and it's the battleground is if we have access to the means of production and the means of reproduction, but the means of production by having a bit of land. So there's those books, and then I just want to say this before we get into more talk about her, that in this book, 1986, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, just so you get the picture of what her references are. I mean, she includes loads of people, but you can see a little bit where she's coming from. She includes Mary Daly. Maria Mies had read Mary Daly and quotes her, and she's in the bibliography, Gynecology. Esther Boserup, that Danish feminist economist from the 1970s. Frederick Engels, we know he wrote that very good, The Family, the Family and the Origins of sort of exploitation. So he recognized the exploitation of women in the family, but then, as Lierre says, they sort of quickly moved on and forgot about it, and particularly Marx did. Sort of said, okay, we've noticed that, but we're not going to actually make it central to our ideas. Betty Friedan. Guillemin, who is a French sociologist, political theorist, who talked about social constructivism. Now, that's an issue with a really good thing about Maria Mies is she's German, and she had access to and read the European ideas, like lots of, like say, Boserup, who's Danish, Guillemin, who's French, Hartmann, German, Hoskin. Now, this is Fran Hoskin, and I feel it's very, very lovely that she mentions her, because Fran Hoskin, correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, but she was this absolute trooper who used to work around the United Nations in the 80s, and she would just get masses of information and put this newsletter out about what was going on globally. She did fantastic campaigns, but she did information sharing. She was just incredible. Okay, Lenin, we've all heard of him. And she quotes him, Rosa Luxemburg, you know, the sort of Marxist socialist feminist who started coming up with some really important ideas and then was sort of left behind. They forgot about her. Mandel, again, another Marxist theorist. Marcuse, sort of Marxist theorist, Marxism. Kate Millett, and then Alice Schwarzer, and then Weinbaum. And the reason I wanted to go through all of this is it's Batcher Weinbaum, and she quotes Batcher Weinbaum in a 1976 publication. I don't know if Batch is here, but we'll definitely make sure we send this to you, Batcher. Women in Transition to Socialism, Perspectives on the Chinese Case, 1976. So she's quoted in this book, and then Clara Zetkin. And then the only other person I want to recommend is this actor that in the preface to the recent publication, Maria Mies says that this Seeds of Movements 2007 is sort of the way forward. So it's nice to know that she's giving us this recommendation that we should read ACTA to find out more about that. So I'm going to stop sharing and then go back, hand back over to you, Lierre, to get more comments on that.
So right away on page 13, you know, there's like this amazing insight where she says, part of the problem of, you know, she's critiquing these various sort of, you know, theoretical frameworks. And she says, the emphasis on sexual stereotyping and attempts to solve the woman question by changing this sexual stereotyping through non-sexist socialization, not only strengthened structural functionalist analysis, but by doing so, blocked the understanding of the deeper roots of women's exploitation and oppression. By defining the man-woman problem as a question of social role stereotyping and of socialization, it was immediately put on an ideological plane. It became a cultural affair. The structural roots of this problem remained invisible, and thus its connection with capital accumulation remained invisible. And I just thought that was an amazing insight that, you know, the moment that the feminist movement starts saying, oh, well, it's all about, you know, just that we socialize boys and girls incorrectly, and, you know, we need to sort of change this things on that sort of level, she's right. Then you stop talking about, well, there's exploitation going on. There's the fact that men are using women, that there's a material basis to all of this. If you just leave it in the cultural realm, you're never going to get to the sort of deeper roots of why all of this happens. And that's what I appreciate about Marxists, you know, whether or not you're going to call yourself a Marxist, whatever, this is always where they're right. You know, that oppression is about this. It's about one group of people having power over another group because they're getting a benefit from it. They're getting some kind of material benefit, and they structure the world so that they can just keep extracting those resources from whoever it is. And in this case, it's men and women. And I just thought that was a really great insight. And then there's this other thing that's related on page 19, where she says, I don't know if I can find the exact quote, but I wrote it down, that there's a difference between liberal and left women in that the liberal women tend to think that the woman question is answered by public participation, whereas more leftist women think it's full economic participation, that's the split between liberal and left. And she does something that's much more radical feminist. And she says that neither of these really answers the problem. And that's why she's gotten, you know, chapters in here about male violence against women and the ways that particularly men hurt women in ways that they don't hurt other people, that there really is something about the fact that women birth every single human, that men want to sexually exploit women as well as economically exploit them. So this to me says that this is a very radical feminist book, because she really has seen sort of the dark heart of patriarchy, and she puts that at the center of the analysis. So yeah, it was brilliant. It's just the clarity of some of these sentences was like, this is exactly it. Thank you, Maria. So
yeah, and I'll get up the PowerPoint again and move on to another. So this is near the beginning. This is in the 2014 preface, so the book that's most widely available that you're likely to be able to get a copy of, unless you've got one tucked away, or from a secondhand bookshop. So she says here, we were not the only ones who tried to understand whether Marxian concepts like the relations of production or modes of production made sense with regard to people who work not directly for the market, but for their sustenance from day to day. Subsistence then became the main concept for us to understand how capitalist accumulation really takes place. We understood immediately that unpaid housework was reproductive work because a woman worked to reproduce the male worker, so he could sell his labor for a wage at the, oh no, I've got this, at the factory door. So this is repeated, you know, this concept that she's explaining has been now sort of accepted, and many of us know this, but I think the 1986, it was one of the, it was a very good articulation, quite an early articulation of this idea that as long as we are doing unpaid housework and we're doing this, we're reproducing the actual people, the male people, we will never fully, we can't participate in the market on that. And then also this idea of capitalist accumulation coming from there, and this idea of primitive accumulation, the first sort of blocks of power and money coming, using violence off women's work. Then I'll move on to the next one and then move back to come back to you, Lierre. So Mies studied lace making women in Narsapur. This is in India, and she spent a long time. This is where she did her research for her PhD, and this PhD became this book, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale. And as with a lot of PhDs that become books, it's quite dense, quite theoretical, very well referenced, and then, you know, there's more in it than other books that she's written, because it's probably 7 years of work or 10 years of work, and it was to get her PhD. So so that would sort of explains a bit why there's so much in this book. And she said they had to combine reproductive work with the lowest paid productive work, and she called this combination the housewifeization of labour, which is a concept that she came up with and then became sort of more widespread and understood, of women doing both of those types of work, and then also doing this work so the lace making women were not doing it in factories, they were doing it at home. So and then their products went off onto the international market. So it was a really different situation from factory work, the sort of male factory work. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hand back over to you, Lierre.
Yeah, and her point is that when, you know, men work in factories, that it gets counted as labor. So it gets counted as, like, you know, the gross domestic product and all that, you know, the kind of international stuff. But it's, you know, just recognize that men are working. And then there's all these ways that this sort of, like, the International Monetary Fund and various banks and various governments, they just completely exploit women's labor by, you know, they do it in the part of the economy that never gets counted. So it's not even barely noticed that women are doing this. And then the women themselves don't even get the money for it. So they're given things like, you know, the core mats and the lace making, and they have to do it at home. And it's just assumed that they've got free time to do it, when in fact, you know, they're raising children and they're collecting firewood and they're having to haul water from wells that are a mile away. Their lives are extremely full doing just basic physical labor to keep life going for everybody. But it's just assumed, since none of that counts as labor, you know, that just keeping life alive doesn't matter. And yet it's what everybody else depends on across the entire world. Like, the whole global economy depends on women doing that basic stuff, but it's not noticed as anything. It's just like the background nature that men just get to have. And so they're given these jobs, quote, jobs to do, but it never counts as part of the formal economy. And then even when they do get paid for it, which is hardly anything, their husbands get the money. Like, they're not even allowed to collect the money for it. So she's got all these examples. There's a whole example where there was this, like, scheme to get, I mean, they were trying to get women more money, I think, but it didn't work at all. They were given, like, a buffalo for milking. And, you know, it turned out that there wasn't any way for them to feed the animals. They didn't have enough land to just let them graze. So they had to go collect grasses for them. And all the land previously that they had used traditionally to gather grass to feed animals had been privatized. So they couldn't just go get it. And when they did try, they were, you know, they would bump into, like, scary men who were like, get off my land. This is mine now. You can't have it anymore. So the commons were completely privatized. So they couldn't, it was really hard for them to buy. So they had ended up having to buy feed. So it's not free anymore to just, you know, have cows that are grazing. So by the time you put in the cost of the feed, there's no money left for them. But in the meantime, literally half of what when they get the profit for it, goes right to the bank to pay for the loan that they were given to get the buffalo. So off the top, half is skimmed off by this international bank, and then whatever's left, they have to buy the feed. So there's almost no profit left, but then that little tiny bit that is left goes to their husbands. So they're
Yeah,
essentially enslaved. I mean, there was nothing in it for them. There was no independence gain. There was no money. They had nothing to show for a year and a half of work at the end of it. It was just a complete failure, except the
yeah.
banks made money, and all this milk flowed into the international market, was powdered and then sent to Europe to make like ice cream and stuff out of. Like the whole thing was just rotten from beginning to end.
And I reading this book, I understood more fully this time that control of the means of reproduction. I always thought the term we need to take control of the means of reproduction as we need to fight back our bodies. And Maria Mies says, yes, in the West, a lot of us women are thinking about having the right to abortion, etc., because we're so far away from having control on the means of reproduction of subsistence. We don't have land, although a few of us might have bits of land, but mostly, almost always, we don't have land, and we get our stuff from the market. So we have lost that space. And I really understood, and it's so good reading it, is that in many parts of the world still, luckily, but there's a massive battle going on all over the world, but particularly the biggest resistance now has been in Africa. Women still have commons, and they have communal access to land, which is reproduction. So they have their bodies, well, and it's obviously a struggle against the men as well to control their own bodies, but they also have communal land or their own land that is where they can live. And then this is all, just as Lierre said, it's being, every time something is privatized, every time the land is taken, every time they're seduced and tricked into joining these little money-making enterprises like having a buffalo, then they fall into debt, and they're told that they're going to make money and they're going to pull their way out of poverty. Whereas what Mies and Vandana Shiva and Silvia Federici, who's done lots of work with them and continued those bits of theoretical stuff, what they all say, and Mies says possibly the first in this book, is it doesn't work. You actually want to contribute. What many women need and want is they want to have the possibility to subsist, to be able to stay alive with forest, with their traditional lands. And that's why they're at the forefront often, and she talks about that very clearly, of these resistance to big dam projects, to IMF, to privatization. And I suppose this book really, I mean, it's right at the beginning of these insights, but she's very clearly understanding. And I suppose I'll just say that she also says the way forward now, one of the ways forward is us to spend more time doing subsistence and doing growing vegetables, sharing clothes, sharing. She gives an example in a recent, this is Maria Mies recently, she said her washing machine broke. Now, instead of going to the market and buying a new washing machine, she went to her neighbor and said, my washing machine's broken, could I share yours and give you some money? And then she said that what that did is it withdraws her from the marketplace, from needing transnational companies, but it also creates this community of need, of subsistence. So the two of them need to get on with each other. And she's got this really interesting link that she says people actually don't have communities of subsistence together where they build bonds, where they're sharing vegetables or sharing washing machines, which we used to have, say, 30, 40 years ago. But if we in the West or anywhere, if we can recreate that is a way of us creating the capacity to stay alive without big business bullying us. She doesn't use the term, but yeah.
Well, one of the takeaway points that I got from this book and also from the subsistence book was that anytime there's an attempt to draw women and also peasants, the people who are doing the basic work of life, to draw them into this global economy, it never ends well for them, because these are always going to be relationships of exploitation. Anything where you are now dependent on, getting paid by people far away, it's never going to work. And that the subsistence work of just keeping life going is really just the basic work of what we do as humans, and that it shouldn't be commodified. That all these attempts to commodify it are just going to be exploitation, because it's not a commodity. It's our relationships to each other and to our communities and to the land and to our own bodies. And there is no way to commodify that without it being just an exploitative experience all around. But that ultimately none of these projects ever go well for that reason. That the moment that you take people who once knew how to provide for themselves and you make them instead dependent on getting money from a faraway entity like a bank or some kind of market, ultimately it's just going to destroy their way of life. And then that means just on every level, they're now going to be dependent rather than independent. So all of their social relationships collapse. And I remember, I don't know if it was in this book or the Subsistence book, but she talks about how when she was a child in Germany, and there was a local a mill that would grind the local grain that people grew right there. And that often there would be, at the end of the growing season, there would be, some guy who just hadn't done whatever, he's an alcoholic or he's dysfunctional or he got sick or just something bad has happened and he can't pay to have the grain ground for his family. And the miller, it just was understood. You just would grind it for him no matter what, because you couldn't let that family starve. It was unthinkable that you would let him starve. Even though he, had messed up in some way, whether it was his fault or not, didn't have the money to pay for it. It doesn't matter. He's a member of your community. You can't let 10 people starve because they had bad luck or, even bad behavior. It's just immoral. So of course you would just put in the time and you would do it for him. And that is sort of the nature of human interaction, that is the community that we should have, the ways that we have this tremendous ability to care for each other because we're a super social species. And that the moment you commodify that, no international bank is going to grind that grain for that fellow, and that family will starve because there's no bond of care. Well, your son is going to marry her daughter someday, and oh, we're related, we're third cousins, and oh yeah, your grandmother saved my wife's life, and whatever. There's going to be those just constant interaction, that web of relationships. And the moment that you put international capital in on top of that and destroy that local economy, it's just a wreck, and then people just sink, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's the end. So
yeah, and there's a couple of comments in the chat. One, Kate says, I'm reminded of Marilyn Waring's 1988 Counting for Nothing, and I've got a copy called If Women Counted, so I think it was different in different countries. It's just stunning and building on loads of those ideas. And then there's also a comment from Deb saying community is being rebuilt in a few ways, community gardens, tool swaps, and also sounds like old farming communities of small farmers. All of that is where we know about these, and it's right. I'm going to show another couple of bits of the PowerPoint that we prepared. So Mies used Rosa Luxemburg's idea. This is in Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale. Rosa Luxemburg's idea that capitalism constantly seeks new strata to exploit, and explains, without the ongoing exploitation of non-waged workers and of natural resources and a perpetual extension of markets, capitalism would not be able to continue its process of permanent primitive accumulation. This process is necessarily based on violence and finally destroys the subsistence of people and nature. This is Mies in the preface, but what we're sort of seeing is that she's linking up the early 20th century Rosa Luxemburg Marxist feminists looking at the Marxist ideas of how capitalism works, and then joining in, making it very clear to us that it's based on violence and it destroys the subsistence, the sort of the ability for us to live, and it destroys nature. And I think those we're seeing it play out even more these days, that the relentless sort of exploitation of people, women and nature based on violence is just carrying on, and they're just looking out to go further and further and further into any of these new strata. So we're seeing, you know, into our bodies, women's bodies, carrying on trying to get into Africa. Like if you people who tell us, or the stuff I've read about what's going on in Africa, there's a massive privatization going on in all of the countryside. All of the people are being made landless. There's the people, you know, bribing male leaders mostly of villages to sell off the forests, the land, privatize. They get a bit of money from it, and then everybody else is dispossessed. It just, so she's saying that. I'm going to go on to another of these slides so we can see. This is a nice, lovely photo of Maria Mies. Women were the cheapest labor force for capital, and they were treated like colonies and nature, like nature. And she makes in this book a very clear link between the beginning in, you know, the times when capitalism was beginning, that it was hand in hand with the witch hunts in Europe. So she sort of, in Patriarchy and Accumulation, she says that the beginning of capitalism came at the same time as women who were resisting, who wanted to keep the land and wanted to keep these subsistence communities going, were ostracized, killed, and that those methods were then exported all over the world to colonies who were then exploited and then further into nature. So she's part of this sort of group of people who talk about this. And then this one, violence. This is one of her subheadings, the secret of capitalist patriarchy. Oh yes, that's interesting. She uses the term capitalist patriarchy a lot, which is, you know, that I think our understanding is often that they are, you know, that's they're linked. The main lesson we learned from the third world women, as well as from our European history, was that direct violence was the means by which women, colonies and nature were compelled to serve the white man, and that without such violence, the European Enlightenment, modernization and development would not have happened. And one of the things I really like about the way that she speaks and writes is that she gives this broad global picture, sort of the big picture of you know, global patriarchy, and she'll say these sort of quite extreme things like the European Enlightenment wouldn't have happened, and I think good for her, you know, that makes sense. Modernization wouldn't have happened without this violence, and the whole concept of development wouldn't have happened. And if you follow up some of Maria Mies's writing and watch her videos or read more about it, she's got this searing critique of the last 40 years of the global development system actually being exploitative, and she just doesn't hold back. It's really clear, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, people know how to get food, they just need to be allowed to do it. And these constant attempts to make them participate in a global market is just it's just income accumulation upwards to the rich from the poor is all it is, and it's all it's ever been. And people just want to be left alone. Honestly, they know how to provide for themselves and their communities. So she's just so clear about all of that. And then this point about you know, colonialism and the sort of, you know, globalization for the last few hundred years. She is, you know, very clear about all of that as well. And she quotes Carolyn Merchant quite a lot in all of this in her book about the death of nature. You know, the point is that for us to get from where we were to a modern industrial economy way of life, you know, based on fossil fuel, there was a vast amount of capital needed, that nature had to be mechanized. And so it meant, like, just the amount of stuff that had to be built to get from here to there. So like the mines and the drills and, you know, just the amount of metal that was used. And all of it required charcoal at the time. And then ultimately, you know, like coal and oil and all of this, but all that infrastructure is just absolutely massive. And what paid for it was the silver and gold mines from South America and Mexico. That all of that gold and silver had to be exploited. It had to be mined there using the most horrible forms of slavery. I mean, you died in those mines. There was no coming out. And so all the indigenous people were put to work, doing the mining. And then so much gold flooded into Europe that it crashed some of their economies. Like Spain was just completely overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do with it. England and some of the other countries in Europe put it to, quote, good use. But good use meant literally paying for the machinery, building the machinery that would then destroy the planet. And that's where we are now. And that's what made it all possible, was the imperialism that got the gold and then paid for that machinery, and then the building of it, and then the wrecking of the planet with that machinery. And so it's a very grim picture, but this is where we are. And this is very good analysis in here of how that happened. So that this and Carolyn Merchant together, I think, are a good pair to read in tandem if this is a subject that interests you.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the slides because there's quite a lot of interesting. I mean, it's just repeating or giving her words. So this is a quote that's from Maria Mies. Now, after the material resources of the colonies have been looted, their spiritual and cultural resources are being transformed into commodities for world markets, which is, what Lierre's just said. One of the things I really like about her analysis is she uses a sort of materialist analysis. She looks at the energy and stuff that is accumulated by using violence against women, nature, and the poor and dispossessed and colonized peoples. So she looks at that, but then she also incorporates spiritual and cultural aspects. And a lovely analogy she uses, actually in a recent video that I was listening to, is she said that women in the West who are trying to find ways to fight this, some of them do things like clothes sharing clubs, where instead of buying new clothes, which are, so that she doesn't, but these new clothes, if they're coming from the global economy, it's almost certain that there's a woman who has been exploited for these clothes. There's nature that's been exploited. So if we can share clothes in communities, then we can reduce that. We can stop participating in the systems of exploitation. But she says that there's a really nice thing about this spiritual thing of you know where the clothes came from. I mean, particularly if somebody made the clothes, but they come from maybe your sister or your neighbor. And when you're wearing them, you are knitting yourselves together in community. And and I suppose my analogy is one of my daughters knitted me a scarf, and it is a totally different experience wearing the thing that she knitted for me. It's sort of profoundly wonderful for me to wear that compared to something that I bought and I am shutting my eyes. I don't know where it came from. I don't know who made it. And there's sort of the love involved in participating in local subsistence networks. And it's just wonderful because by reading her ideas, you can then sort of rejuvenate or do some of the things. Now, another thing, I'm just going to go on to this because it's on the PowerPoint. So what Maria Mies says is, perhaps the most radical change in all spheres of life has come through the internet. Hitherto, we had thought that reality is something we can see, touch, smell, and that can be perceived by all our senses. In short, reality means that we live in a material world where life has a beginning and an end. The internet, however, creates a virtual world in which everything is possible, in which all borders are eliminated and death no longer exists. The internet is not a tool, but a kind of surrogate religion. Yet people believe in it and that it will create a new world. The far-reaching consequences of this faith are not yet known. Now, she wrote this in 2014. It's really interesting, isn't it? That one of the wonderful things about her writing is that she speculates and she's very creative and she's sort of guessing. And this term here, the internet, is not at all but a kind of surrogate religion, is something that I was thinking a couple of years ago. It's sort of a religion, and it's just lovely that the whole thing is a kind of surrogate religion. And it's great. So the more you read of her work, the more you see these amazing sentences and insights, and then that can spark our own understanding and searching and talking to each other about solutions. And yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing.
It's not a coincidence that the most powerful transgender activists, at least in the United States, is this guy Martin Rathblatt, who honestly thinks that we can upload ourselves into computers, that we're going to live forever inside these computers, and that in fact the whole world, the entire cosmos, is going to be replaced by these little itty bitty nanobot machines that he wants to make. It's just pure necrophilia, the amount that this man hates the entire living world, and would like to replace it with little versions of him, essentially, as if this is ever going to be possible. But he thinks he's a woman. And of course he's not, but it's the same thing. It's the hatred of his body, the hatred of nature as it's been evolved, the hatred of life, which is his body, and he hates it. And he is, this is my speculation. I've never met him, but what I see in this is just pure narcissistic rage, that he can't get what he wants. That nature has not given him the body that he desperately wants. And instead of just accepting that he has a perfectly good body, he's just a family annihilator on a massive scale. He literally wants to turn the world into a machine. And this is just his narcissistic rage because he can't get what he wants. But he honestly believes that we can be immortal by putting ourselves into computers. And that is just, the necrophilic, the end point of patriarchy is necrophilia, as Mary Daly said so strongly in 1978. This has only come to pass more and more as the decades have worn on. She was absolutely right about it.
Right, I'm going to go back to, I think I might just go through quite a lot of these slides because we've got quite a few actually, and then make sure we get through them just because they're great, so we can really focus on her. So at once, she says capitalism is just the latest avatar of patriarchy. Fantastic insight there. You can see Maria Mies here being an activist. She's just been so active in campaigning as well as thinking and writing. Now, she says here, it became impossible to overcome the limited view of cultural relativism, which claims that women are divided by culture worldwide, whereas in fact, we are both divided and connected by commodity relations. Now, in her book, Capitalism, Patriarchy and Accumulation, she says that there is a division because the women in the West, who are women, are buying products that are made by women in, as she called it, the third world, or the sort of poorer countries, and who are exploited. And she said she's sort of wanted to look at that relationship between these commodity relations and the different positions that women in, but then also say we are connected. And she also says that we are, as women, we do have a commonality, and she rejects this idea that there's no difference. So she was writing, this is 86, in the time when a lot of men and some women were saying it's imperialism for women in the West to consider in any way that we are related to women in the South because they just want to make a living, those sorts of things. There's no global sisterhood. She really did believe in global sisterhood. Right, and then I'm going to just go through a couple more of the things she said. She says the various forms of direct violence against women are analysed not as a result, this is in her book, of some timeless inborn male sadism, but as a mechanism in the process of ongoing primitive accumulation, by which men try to accumulate wealth and productive capital, based not on economic, but on direct coercion and on the extension of patriarchal control over women. Now, this is me at the bottom saying, I think this analysis comes from more from a Marxist feminist perspective than radical feminists. And I think this is a place where she's different, because she's saying that it's well, which sees men as getting sexual or personal power or gratification from violence. That's what radical feminists do. Mies is suggesting that the motivation for violence is getting stuff. And I think she's giving men a bit of a get out there. And well, certainly in some of her writing, it's like she's sort of saying, well, they're just doing it because they want stuff, they want power. Whereas my understanding is that they also want the act of dominance. They enjoy the one-to-one, the moment when they tell their wife to do the washing up, or that, you know, she's an idiot, or she needs to produce better, like iron his clothes better. I think that is, and I think she's calling that inborn male sadism. And I mean, whether it's inborn or not, it's effective male sadism that's happening now. So I'm going to ask Lierre. I mean, I think you said, Lierre, when we were talking before, that you think there are some things that maybe Maria Mies is wrong on, or you disagree with. So it might be because we're coming near to the end. What sort of areas did you think of that, or about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. She at one point, there's a section in the book where she tries to explain the origins of patriarchy. And I think that that is a very worthwhile project. I think that we all want to know why do men do these things? When did it start? Has it always been this way? Or is it just biological? Is there a way out? And so she takes a stab at it. And I just think that her explanation just doesn't hold together at all for me. I read it, that part of it, twice, sitting on an airplane. And I just was like, I don't really get the ABC here of what she thinks has happened. So that's one part where I'd be like, I mean, I'd be curious to know what other people think about it, what other women think about it. It's one part of the book that to me didn't really hold together. That doesn't in any way, you know, null the rest of her argument, because I think she's absolutely right about everything else. But that part of the book just didn't seem, and she's trying, you know, which I really appreciate, because I want that question answered, but I didn't find her explanation. It just didn't make any sense. It's all about like who sees their bodies as a tool and who doesn't. And like, I don't know, all this stuff about, you know, did men hunt or who didn't and who did, and is that what led to, and I just don't see it. So anyway, that was one part of the book that I didn't think was particularly useful. But I did appreciate about her was that she's very clear that prostitution is violence against women, that it's abhorrent, that it's just a massive human rights violation, and that both men and the state are using it as a way to yet again use women and accumulate more wealth. So that's in there, you know, very strongly in there. And that to me says, you know, she is basically a radical feminist, whether she calls herself one or not. That part of it, she's,
I mean, yeah, I would add that I think that she doesn't, now you might say I'm wrong, but in my understanding, she doesn't mention lesbianism.
Right.
And I have always found it, and I just think that to not mention it, and not mention it as part of the problem, the fact that you're not allowed to be lesbian, and even to just pretend it's not existing. I mean, she's talking about patriarchy, capitalist patriarchy, violence against women, and she must have been aware of the idea of compulsory heterosexuality, and the fact that lesbians have a tough time and you're not allowed, it's a taboo on lesbianism. And I think she sidesteps that as, well, she's married, or she was married. I mean, I don't know if she's alive, and I don't know if her husband's still alive, but she was married to a man. And I think that sometimes there's a sort of, and it, you know, also in terms of having a platform, possibly she found it comfortable or easier to not mention that. And I think that is a lack in her writing.
Right.
And then also the trans stuff. Now she's terribly old now, so we can't really expect her to speak out on that. But the trio that she is associated in my mind with, Vandana Shiva, Silvia Federici, and her, have all done this really interesting work on which is a global, looking at exploitation, but they Vandana Shiva and Silvia Federici have not do not agree with us, although slightly Silvia Federici has said obscure things that indicate she might tinily agree with us, but not really. And I think not saying anything about it, sort of, it's that whole thing of all that UN, like women who have a position and have a platform, just not saying anything as if that's fine. I think they should. So I disagree with that, and you know, you can't really blame Maria Mies not for speaking out, because she's probably happily retired. But just to know, if you're
she's
reading
like 92 years old. We found out she's still alive, which is really fun. But she's she's old, you know, and I don't know that at 92 you want to take on something like that. I just don't know how I'm going to feel when I'm 92. I'll get back to you on that one. But I think that's a really good insight, Joe, that I think that if she was either a lesbian herself or saw the possibilities of lesbianism, that there would be more of a critique of heterosexuality in this book. There's nothing, it's not mentioned as an institution at all. So she does sort of the same thing that the Marxists do, where there's all these assumptions that just serve women up to men as if this is normal, natural, unspoken, just the way of the universe. And I think it would have been a slightly different and better book if that had also been thrown in there as one institution that is definitely to women's detriment and men's benefit in a massive way. If that had been included in this book, I think that would have been a better book. So that's a book someone needs to write, and hopefully one of our audience members will write it, because that would be really good.
I'm going to go on. We've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to just quickly go through the last of the slides, because you can then see more of what she says. So she discusses sex and gender in chapter 1. Now this is 86. She says, what is feminism? In which she argues against the use of gender because it can be used to obfuscate sexism. So that she saw straight away that using the word gender would hide sexism itself, and men would say that gender stereotypes for men were difficult. So good for her. That's very good in the book. But she seems to think that gender is something like a collective soul or an identity rather than oppression. So again, that's a difference with radical feminists, or certainly the way I see it, which is the sort of based on Sheila Jeffrey's idea that gender hurts. In Sheila Jeffrey's book, Gender Hurts, that gender is the means that we are oppressed. Whereas Maria Mies does seem to think that you can have well, it's almost like a soul or an identity. So I disagree with her on that, and it might be, if people read it, that you can shed more light on that, about that. So I thought that's another area. This is a brilliant quote. Peace in patriarchy is war against women. Absolutely. Fantastic. And then here, a bit later on in the book, she has similar thinking to Carol Pateman. Now, she doesn't quote in the bibliography Pateman the Sexual Contract, who I think that was written in a bit just after this, actually, but it was around the same time. She says, in the political sphere, the state monopoly over direct violence obviously stops at the door of the private family. If this is so, then the lines dividing the private from the public is necessarily the same line, so it should be the line that divides the private, unregulated male violence, the rule of might, from the unregulated state violence, the rule of right. So again, absolutely brilliant insight, where she's saying that the state is going to create a public sphere that should be the police stopping people beating each other up, and that is offered to people in the public sphere, but there's going to be unregulated male violence, the rule of might, in the private sphere. So she has that exact same insight about violence. So that's, and then of course that's been our big struggle, isn't it? It's not domestic violence. We've been fighting that, and to some extent made some inroads into stopping that, changing laws. And I guess that's a big battleground that is not been completely won yet. Chapter 6 is about national liberation and women's liberation. Really interesting things about the links between liberating the nation and women, and some of the sort of betrayals that have happened. And then feminist perspective on society. And then this is, I think, that the last one. The feminist concept of labour has therefore to be orientated towards a different concept of time. Again, interesting, in which time is not segregated into portions of burdensome labour and portions of supposed pleasure and leisure, but in which times of work and times of rest and enjoyment are alternating and interspersed. Such a new concept cannot, of course, be brought about unless the existing sexual division of labour is abolished.
Yeah, and
So
I
I'll go
think
back to
like
you.
most women who are mothers are going to experience those things all at once, because you love your children, you have these incredible moments of closeness and, endorphins flowing, and there's, your beautiful, incredibly cute baby or your little child. And it's also exhausting. You haven't had enough sleep for 3 weeks, and, you can't take one more day of this, but at the same time, you take another look at your child and you're like, this is everything. This is the most love I've ever felt. So I think that for women, it's just a really different thing, that the way that we produce life, experience life, really doesn't have a great overlap with the demands of capitalist patriarchy, as she would say. And, even things like the experience of time on just a moment-to-moment basis is going to be different than that sort of regimentation that the essentially factories demanded of people. And just for everyone to remember that it hasn't been that long that most production was taken out of the home and put somewhere else, that until very recently, nobody left home. Your workshop, everything was there, and it was a collective family endeavor, whether you were cobblers or millers or farmers or whatever it was you were doing, everybody was there doing it together in a workshop. And then along comes capitalism and this whole factory model, the industrialization, all of that leaves. And it has to happen somewhere else, and somebody else controls it. And then men are relegated to being, just little cogs in that factory. And then what of women? So that's where we are. But that is a very recent development in human history. Like we are used to this because it's what we've ever known, but it's not normal. It's not how we evolved to live, and it really doesn't match our needs as human beings. So, I mean, that's why people are against capitalism. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the books I like the most, well, probably all the books I like the most, have a way forward, and they tell us, they help us understand the world, but then how to change it, and then it works. And I think that this book has some really useful advice. It's reminded me, one, of the global picture, and it's a lot of it, I mean, she's so right what she said then, but it's also relevant now. But then it has a way forward, this trying to take back areas of subsistence and make community links, like grow some more potatoes and share them with your friends. That matters. That actually is a very small part of the big picture of our resistance. And I think that really is nice, because we feel very powerless sometimes. We understand the big picture but can do nothing about it. But it really seems like it could work if we all did that, if we all just withdraw from the monster of capitalist patriarchy as much as we can. Of course, it's not, but even if we just do it in small ways, we grow some of our own food, and we link up in our communities to do with reproducing life. She makes this great point. You don't want to just link up in your community having fun. You want to link up by need. So if you can link up with, say, food or sharing tools, as somebody put in chat, Deb put in the chat, that's sort of more powerful, because we're actually sustaining life. Like, we could stay alive. And it's given me loads of ideas of like, right, I'm going to do that. But I think the more we do it, the more joy we get. And that's, of course, what we want. We want to have some joy now. Okay, so over to you for a final sentence or point.
Yeah, I think the one thing missing from this book is I don't know if she knows Heide Günther-Abendorf, the one who does the matriarchy studies, but that was one thing that's missing sort of, I think, in her solutions, is that it really has to be back to that sort of gynocentric matrifocal model where, mother-child is the central unit and everything is organized around that. And she doesn't really talk about that, but to me, that's sort of the core of the world that we need to get back to. And I think she would probably agree with it, but she doesn't say it. So again, it's another book to read in tandem with this one. If you're
will you tell us that the name of the author of that book, this other book?
So it's Heide. She's also German. Haida and then Guttner Abendorf. It's like a hyphenated last name, and it's called Matriarchal Studies. She has her whole website. I think you've done a seminar about her book. Anyway, it's just this collection. It's an amazing book. It's like 500 pages long, and it's just a collection of still extant matriarchies around the world, or cultures that you can see were matriarchal until very recently. And so she traces all of the different kind of patterns of matriarchal cultures that you can still see. And they've had big conferences too, where people come from all over the world who still live in these matrifocal communities, and they come and they present and they talk about how they do things. And it's just incredibly inspiring that, we're not making it up, like this is a real thing. But that's, what to aim for.
Okay, well, thank you everybody who's been here. I just want to want to let you know what's happening next week, which I haven't done yet. Next week we have On the Meaning of Sex, on the New Definition of Woman by Kaiser Ekis Ekman. So it's a new book, it's just out in English, and I think it's probably in Swedish as well, but it's On the Meaning of Sex, on the New Definition of Women by Kaiser Ekis Ekman, and it's going to be discussed by Kaiser Ekis Ekman and Anna Giulio Delizio, so it will be fantastic. Same time. Just remember, some people's hours are changing, so if your hour's changing, just bear that in mind, but maybe see you in the breakout rooms, but otherwise see you next week. And thank you very much, Lierre. Thanks everyone who's been here. Bye.